Family business makes no sense. So let's talk about it.
Welcome to another episode of the series Family Business Makes No Sense, where our starting proposition is that the concept of family is so diametrically opposed to the concept of business that if you're daft or game enough to put the two together in a family business, you are inevitably going to experience conflict, as those two very different entities find their areas of clash and negative interaction. Today we're talking about dysfunctional personalities that lead to disruptive behaviours, which is a very common cause of conflict in family business when an individual family member becomes a cause of conflict in both family and business as a consequence of their having a disruptive personality. So what we're going to talk about today is not only what that is and why it happens, but more importantly, what you can do about it so that your family business does make sense. Because we know that a good family business wipes the floor with just about every other type of commercial organisation. But although there are hundreds of thousands of them out there, good family businesses are quite hard to find, and the vast majority don't survive beyond a couple of generations, and some of those, even if they do, are not happy places to live or work. I'm Jon Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, and I'm broadcasting today from Melbourne in Australia. I've been working for many years with many families, and one of the things that I have really learnt over those years is that the vast majority of family conflicts, although they present as being something to do with money, they are more about relationships and sense of unfairness than they are to do with legal rights and obligations. And then that leads us to conclude that the most effective way of dealing with the conflicts that arise in those situations will be through empathic problem solving, not approaching something as a lawyer or as an accountant or as a psychologist or any of those things, but basically saying, let's take this thing to pieces, understand exactly what is going on and why, and then let's work out what we need to do to fix the problem and maybe help the individuals, and who can help us to do that, because there's a good chance that one person will not have all the knowledge and skills necessary to deal with the totality of the problems. So this is, as I mentioned before, cause number 7 in a series of 50 common causes. And if we have a better understanding of what a dysfunctional personality is and what causes it, and how dysfunctional personalities translate into disruptive behaviours, we've got a better chance of dealing with it. So if that's of interest to you, please buckle up and come along for the ride. So the first thing we need to do is understand the relationship between personality development, and development into the area of dysfunctional personality, and the impact it has on people's preferred behaviours and ultimately disruptive behaviours. Understand that personality is a subset of character which describes how people are likely to behave in a given situation. 30 to 50% of personality is biological, it's genetic. You're born with the basic imprints which come down through generations of ancestors. That leaves 50 to 70% to be formed by your environment, by the growing up years, by your education, by your native intelligence, by the ethnic community you belong in, social environment, economic environment, all of those things. These will all have an impact. And because environmental factors have an impact, we also need to consider that in some cases, people will be adversely affected by psychological and or emotional trauma that has caused lasting injury and damage, which is then shown, because it's non-physical, in the way that they behave. Important to understand that the brain and the mind are two different things. The brain is a physical organ, and it's where an awful lot of stuff in our bodies happens. But the mind is something that is a construct of our brains. And the mind of any living animal is going to be a combination of evolution and also environmental factors. Here we're talking about damage to the mind, not necessarily damage to the brain. And so one of the things we'll explore is that if you can successfully treat the damage that has occurred to the mind, you may be able to bring a person who is dysfunctional and disruptive back into the fold, certainly of the family, maybe of the business, through successful treatment. So we're going to explore what that looks like and how it all happens. Psychological trauma occurs when somebody goes through an event that they are unable to cope with emotionally and psychologically. So there's been a lot of talk in relatively recent years about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the sort of thing that people initially were thought to suffer from in the military, where they would go through some event or other which created massive trauma for them at an emotional, psychological level, which they were then unable to cope with because it stressed them to a point beyond their coping abilities, no matter how good or tough they were in every other way. And that then filtered into an injury to the mind, which resulted in dysfunctional personality and disruptive behaviours, hyperanxiety, all sorts of things. So a lot of what we're talking about here can be sort of related to the way you treat PTSD, because it's fundamentally a similar thing. Now, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's session, it's that a dysfunctional personality should not be allowed to run amok in a family business. But unfortunately, that's often what happens, and I suspect it's largely because the parents of the dysfunctional individual have worked out they probably could not survive in the outside world, but there is a soft feather bed for them within a family business that is obviously privately owned, with the founders and the owners leading that business. The problem with that is that the doughy-eyed parent, or the overly protective parent, does not see the damage caused to their business by that disruptive behaviours of the dysfunctional individual. So, for example, if you put somebody in a role where you say, well, they're not customer facing, they're not directly staff facing, we'll put them in charge of marketing. It looks to be a relatively safe place, but year after year, when they miss the dates for getting the catalogue out for the Christmas sales, which represents 60 to 70% of the business's total sales for the year, they are creating massive damage for the business and huge conflict within people working in the business who are having all their hard work destroyed by their failure to perform, and then they're not being held to account. So what we would say is that as soon as you have worked out that you have got somebody who has got a dysfunctional personality, whether or not they've got a certifiable mental illness, if they are creating significant damage and disruption in the business, you need to take them out of the business and say, we need to deal with this person, we need to help them, we need to treat them, we need to deal with them, we need to provide for them as a family project, not as a business project. Because business is all about performance, it's all about merit, it's all about doing things by the book, And this is a situation that doesn't lend itself to treatment in that way at all. Just think, if you had somebody who was as disruptive as a family member who wasn't a family member, would they stay employed? Generally, no. There's your answer. So, what sort of strategies and solutions do we need to apply? The first one is you need to take a pragmatic problem-solving approach. You need to be objective about what you're dealing with, and you need to find solutions that work for the business and for the family. In the business, it will usually be take the disruptor out so they don't damage the business, and then the business can support the family and thrive as a business. In the family, the question is, can we cope with this problem in the family? And that may mean individuals in the family will step up and take responsibility, or they may engage professionals such as psychologists, counsellors, coaches, you name it, to help that individual because they bring expert skills into the equation. In any case, it is fundamental that you have to face reality. The problems that we see most frequently are when the situation has been allowed to deteriorate to the point where best people in the business are walking out, the business itself may be at risk because of the critical failures to perform have had significant impact on the business. And we often see it in a crisis environment because it's been let go or denied or avoided for so long, it's now become a major, major problem. One of the challenges for parents who always hate to consider that a child of theirs, and let's remember this child could be 30, 40, 50, even older, if the word psychologist or the word mental health or mental illness is raised, a lot of families shut down. They prefer to deny or avoid, or they have no choice, they're just compelled to deny or avoid rather than deal with the problem. That often comes back to guilt, that the parent hasn't picked up the problem at an early enough stage to make it easy to resolve, or that they feel guilty because they have allowed their child to suffer a trauma that's caused this impact, or they simply have no idea of how to deal with the problem, and so they protect unconditionally in the hope that eventually the problem will fix itself, which of course it never does, because the indulgence of the disruptive behaviour tends to reinforce that bad behaviour and normalise it for the individual with a dysfunctional personality, and it then simply becomes incorporated in their reality, and it becomes non-exceptional. It's a bit like parents indulging misbehaving immature young children and thereby reinforcing their bad behaviour by making it appear to be acceptable and normal. That it will not be helpful in the long term for anybody, because it will create problems in the business with staff and others, and it will certainly create problems in the family with resentful siblings and so on who see overindulgence being exerted towards one of the family members who is seen to be a less of a contributor than other members of the family. So sense of fairness goes out the window. What the family is likely to do once they have extracted the family member from the business is comfort, if you've got people in the family who are good at doing that. Almost certainly you will need to get some medical or psychological or counselling assistance, which not only comforts and builds trust with a dysfunctional individual, but also uncovers the root causes of their behavioural dysfunction, and then starts to build strategies that help the individual to recontextualise, change perceptions, and also develop some very specific strategies to help them deal with whatever triggers send them off onto their disruptive behaviours. Now, I mentioned before that a lot of this is related to treatment of PTSD, and where the traditional concepts are that psychological treatment, therapeutic treatment, can take a whole lifetime, a couple of hours a month on a couch. There are solutions that have come out of the PTSD side of things, which are very, very much quicker at producing very profound results. One of those I've come across is a process called EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. And it's a process that teaches specific physical responses to triggering events to bring them under control. So it's a coping mechanism. So on the one hand, we get expert specialist support to deal with the psychological aspects of behaviours, and that's happening outside of the business, not in the business. If it's successful over the long term, then it may allow that individual to come back into the business using proper policies for employment used by the business in general. Certainly they're likely to be re-entered into the family in a more comfortable sort of a way. Question whether objectively they're good enough to come back into the business, or whether the family needs to work with them to develop a different life plan altogether. Within the business, you need to get some objectivity. An advisory board, an external advisor, something of that sort, who can look at sympathetically and empathetically, look at the impact of the individual on the business and suggest ways of removing them, fixing the problems in the business, fixing the broken relationships with staff and others in the business, so the business survives into the future and then generates income to support the family. And then finally, once we've got things onto a more even keel, the individual who we've taken out of the business may benefit substantially from having a personalised personal development program delivered by a coach who helps them build the skills in the areas where their damage has caused major weaknesses and caused bad reputation and all sorts of other consequences, help them to overcome all of that so they can re-enter into the workforce and become a normal, useful, contributing person, because you don't want them sitting at home feeling like they're failures as this treatment progresses. So the very last point I'd like to make is that on the entry point to the treatment, we should be looking at the exit point, and the exit point is the glittering prize of a return to success in both the family, private life, and in the workplace. If you found this video useful and you think it might be helpful for other people that you know, please let them know about it. Please subscribe, please like, and I look forward to seeing you for our next video, which will be out in about a week. Thanks for watching.